Thanks.
Okay, so our next speaker today, whose presentation was apparently lost, and so he just has to upload it again. He didn't lose it.
I didn't lose it,
It wasn't
no,
Mark's
no.
fault. Is Mark
Could
van
be.
Asten. I always confuse it with von Epstein, who's a researcher on stem cells at our university. I always want to say that.
Oh,
But you're not going to talk about stem cells today. You're
I
going to talk
can.
about
Cell therapies? Or...
phytoxigene assays for screening and monitoring harmful algal blooms. Thank you, Mark.
Pleasure. Okay. It's actually, well, I mean, for all the speakers, I think it's a pleasure to get a chance of sort of presenting to the home crowd and some of their research, and I'm similarly inclined. It's been, this is my fourth meeting, second time I've presented, and over that time sort of I've been involved in sort of trying to, I say, translate technology that's homegrown. And this is sort of a story that sort of is evolving over that time. But I first wanted to put up a nice pretty picture because Susie and Jonathan did a great job yesterday, and this is the best I could do. No mountains or snow or anything, but you know, we normally put sort of nice blooms and stuff, so we have to do something. As Bala sort of said just a little while ago, sort of this technology was utilised over 10 years ago for the bloom in Warragamba Dam, and the results out of Brett's lab sort of kept the water flowing, being treated, and it turned out to be sort of the right call, but it was a sort of a line ball decision at the time. And we often reflect that sort of these new technologies or otherwise, how quickly can they be adopted, or how quickly should they be adopted, but it's been a fairly long road from its first application in a crisis situation to where we are now. And last year, well, 2 years ago at the presentation in Brisbane, I sort of gave an update of where we're at in developing this technology. And for those that either weren't there or otherwise, the phytoxigene or the gene assays for Cyanobacteria are really a 16-year collaboration between Brett and his team, myself and the National Measurement Institute, who we contracted to make certified standards of the genes, so that should it be inclined at some point in time in the future, specific levels of genes be sort of criteria points for decisions, there was a certifiable record of what those values are. And the genes, or at least the critical ones in the assay, the microcystin nodularum, cylindrus mopsin, and saxitoxin, both for dinoflagellates and for cyanos, really have been sort of identified in the early 2000s up to 2008, and therefore sort of utilising that technology into, or translating that into a assay, a test that can be utilised in water management has been the next 10 years or so. So I just wanted to update that story of where we are. We, over the, having developed the assay and trying to commercialise it, keep a close eye on what's going around the world and looking at sort of hotspots where, there's an opportunity of slotting in the technology. And I've got to say, the last 6 months, with the very hot summer in Europe and otherwise, the news stories about algal blooms have been particularly sort of large number. And monitoring reports everywhere from Finland to obviously the 2016 in the Murray River, which continues to show presence of those organisms. Holland, Netherlands had a bad year, stopping people from swimming in all their reservoirs or beaches. Salem in Oregon was the first time they had a do not drink advisory from one of their pure pristine lakes with a microcystin. They had never experienced that before. Florida, has been previously sort of cited, has for the second year has massive blooms. This picture below is from last year's bloom. This is this year's. I sort of note that last year's, I think they were citing microcystin levels of around 800 ppbs, and there was one report this year that said it's not as bad this year, it's only 400 or 500, so we shouldn't complain so much. Then New York, there's 12 lakes up in upper New York in the Catskills that were reporting sort of bloom activity, toxic blooms. These are sort of high-value homes from holiday homes out of New York City, Utah, Ohio. Lake Erie finally got designated as an impaired water body. And there were reports out of UK, Canada, more in California, Kansas, Dakota, Delaware. So basically, sort of if you look at the last 4 years, there's been an elevation of risk. And on the back of all this sort of newsworthy and public opinion or otherwise is the environment for change. And that change, hopefully for us at least, is to exploit the sort of paradigm that, you know, if you have a genetic pathway basically sort of responsible for gene production, so if you don't have the gene, it's a very simple and easy sort of technology to discriminate whether or not there's a toxin species present or not. The assay, and many of you have sort of seen this or have actually utilised the test in some ways, is a multiplex assay that gives you a measure of 16S through a 16S ribosomal RNA gene, an internal amplification control to monitor sort of inhibition in the amplification process. There's targets then for microcystin nodularum, which is a common microcystin E gene, a cylindrospermopsin, a saxitoxin. The assay, sort of from a lab point of view, can be run in an hour and a half or so. We're using the certified standards from NMI, and it targets the pathway, not specific species, genus, or order. And we do it in two sort of parallel kits. Firstly, the 16S with the AMP control, and then specific toxic genes. So results at a high level give you a presence of cyanobacteria. What's the indicative level of that cyanobacteria? Is there a toxic gene present? How much of the toxic gene is present? And it potentially gives you a target for conformational testing downstream. I was sort of mentioning sort of, okay, 10 years on, why are we in the position we're in? And there was an opportunity when Toledo in 2014 had a do not drink advisory warning for 3 days. The governor in Ohio sort of said, well, we don't want that again. And they initiated a process of evaluation and change within that state to look at sort of new monitoring methods or new methods of managing their public water system. And through some meetings and some opportunity, and I suppose exploiting that opportunity, and a lot of travelling around Ohio, they set up in 2016 a public water system draft rules, which included our assay as a screening tool, along with matched microcystin ELISAs. And they were interested in the utility of the saxitoxin assay, and if a gene was detected, they would actually match that with ELISA saxitoxin assays as well. And I think it's at this point that I sort of said this was happening at the last meeting in Brisbane. And so now I can sort of tell you what has happened over the last 18 months within Ohio using the assay in their screening protocol. So sort of looking at the June to December 2016, which is the crosses or the plus signs. These are just the areas or the lakes, the public water systems that were positive for microcystin during that period. The yellow is any appearance of microcystin over the 5-year period, 2010 to 15. And you can see Ohio has a particularly sort of high incidence of microcystin in their public water system. Lake Erie runs along this foreshore, and in actual fact, nearly every sample over summer was positive for a microcystin there anyway, so it's a high-risk water body. So the upshot of the 2016 sort of evaluation, out of 119 public water systems, microcystin by ELISA was detected in 38% of those water bodies, 45%. And the microcystin E gene was detected in 48%, so 10% more had gene present than what was detected in the raw water. 98% of the samples were positive for microcystin gene and also positive for the ELISA. So as an overall, if you're looking at qualitatively, an overall sensitivity or correlation of 98%, at least at the sensitivity of ELISA. 2% of the samples that were negative for the gene detection, where there were microcystins, 19 of those 22 sites had detections in the week prior or the week after sampling, and most of them were very low, around the low level. So either sampling error events or timing issues or just low-level detections. More importantly, or I think more excitingly out of this, once they sort of, analysed the sort of data, out of the 1,850 paired water samples, 100% of the microcysteines that were over 1.6 micrograms had a paired microcystin gene detection. So it was always positive when it was over the regulatory limit, the EPA regulatory limit. And 100% when it was over 5 micrograms had detections of a level of 5,000 gene copies per mil. So they were able to sort of discriminate sort of a risk level for levels of over 5. And if it was over 1.6 micrograms per mil, 90% of those samples were over 5,000 gene copies. I actually sort of then throw up our NHMEC guidelines, and I like to sort of say that the premise of this, of course, is that if you have a microcystin producer that is 100% or all toxic, our notification levels are 2,000 cells and 6,000, 5,000 cells. And I found it really intriguing that the 5,000 came up as being a significantly risk-orientated factor if you use the gene copy, and gene copy then is obviously looking at specifically those toxic cells. So there was, I thought, a reasonable correlation with what Australia had been doing, at least at the enumeration sort of level. Sort of to highlight this even more as far as a risk factor, here is sort of the microcystin levels that, below detection or below detection by ELISA. The 0.3 to 1.6, which is the low detection levels, and particularly upon the EPA sideline, the limits that children were not to be exposed to microcystin levels, and then the 1.6 regulatory level. And you can sort of see over that period, you can have detections of microcystin gene anywhere from non-detect to 29,000 gene copies per mil. For the mid-level, anything from non-detect to 29,000. But once you get into over the 1.6, it's either 450 gene copies up to 4.10 to the 6. Not surprisingly, 16S is a total cyanobacteria measure. Didn't have any sort of correlation per se. You could have a non-toxic species there and still have 6 to the 7, 10 to the 6 from non-detect. The midpoint again was sort of cross-correlated, or it was similar to that. But once you actually got a massive bloom or some fairly high microcystin, it never went below 1.4 10 to the 6 to 3.10 to the 8th. So it sort of, you can't use it necessarily to dictate if you've got a toxic species or not, but certainly there was a level in which, highlighted a risk. When you tease down to sort of additional information as far as sort of bloom dynamics, species dynamics, here's sort of a profile from May through to October. The black line is the microcystin by ELISA, and the yellow dots are the microcystin E gene concentrations. And you can sort of see that sort of when microcystin was positive per the summary data, obviously the ELISA was positive, but you had shifts in population from Planthrix through to non-microcystin Cyanobacteria, Pseudobena and Microcystis. And they're building up these records within their water bodies or their public water systems and trying to identify sort of obviously those species or occurrences that relate to higher levels of toxicity or not. But that's sort of one of their sort of go-to. When they saw high levels of microcystin gene concentrations, they also, there was consistent high levels of microcystin being produced or identified with the genes. And many of the cases, the gene preceded the microcystin detection by a week or two. Here's just one profile where the genes were positive in 2 reservoirs or 2 public water systems, and a couple of weeks later it was positive by ELISA. 16S trends with microcystin E genes don't necessarily follow. Here's sort of a case of the gene sort of matching the positivity of a rise of 16S. The 16S or the total cyanobacteria remains high. The gene copy drops along and proceeds then by a dropping of the microcystin ELISA positivity. Meanwhile, the bloom sort of takes a little bit more time before it declines. Again, this is just another one. You've got the gene sort of positive in the timeline. It's dropping along with the microcystin values by ELISA, but then you actually have a rise in 16S, which is clearly a non-toxic sort of, bloom or event. They also, did this over winter, and they found, partly to their surprise, but they have a couple of reservoirs that are like Lake Tahoe that are positive all the time. But many of their reservoirs were showing high levels of microcystin during fall, winter, and then spring, and that continues to be the case as well. So these are just sort of highlights. In November, they were getting sort of microcystin hits, and again in May as well, and December. What really came out that's got them slightly worried is saxitoxin presence in Ohio. This was something they never really monitored for, or at least specifically were worried about. And 33 public water systems, or 22%, had no historic saxitoxins but were detected by gene, and 15 of those, over half, or just under half, actually had saxitoxin by ELISA, and 6 of them actually had finished water that was positive. And for the first time, they found confirmed a cylindrospermopsin toxin presence in one of their reservoirs as well. So as far as the saxitoxin, they were worried about which of the species was producing it, and this sort of highlights that the gene was positive over a whole time profile with numerous species that are known to be producers, and they haven't got a clue at the moment what's actually producing it. Not different to maybe a Murray River problem and how we speciate things. Again, saxitoxin gene detections preceded sort of the detection of the toxin, and they actually now use it from a management standpoint that if you get a gene hit, then they go into conformational testing and they don't do anything else for saxitoxin other than the gene assay. So this is just another example of the gene being positive before the saxitoxin is identified. It'll identify simultaneous saxitoxin microcystin, so it's the multiplexing characteristics sort of were confirmed as being useful. And here's just sort of a correlation between their enumeration versus the 16S. Clearly it's not a great one-to-one correlation, but there is obviously a trend here, and it's on the right side of the curve, so I suppose it's identifying a little bit more sensitivity versus enumeration. So the data interpretation, so sort of in summary, Ohio's continuing to use this. They've put it now from draft rules into their rules. It's the first sort of, call it state regulatory body that has adopted the technology sort of as their go-to sort of inclusion in their screening. So microcystin detection will indicate the onset of a bloom. More severe blooms over 5 micrograms will be indicative of gene copy number over 5,000. Sax-A gene detections are associated with saxitoxin, but you can get some low cases of gene counts with higher saxitoxin, and that's likely to be benthic source material, given that these water samples are collected generally at inlets and are integrated water samples. And 16S is indicative of the presence of cyanobacteria but not cyanotoxins, which I think we could, in this audience, clearly understand. So saxitoxin, they showed, was effective specific as a screen. Microcystin was also effective and specific as a screen. The multiplex worked for them. 16S was not effective for cyanotoxins, but were potentially used for assessing susceptibility. Phytoplankton enumeration was not effective for saxitoxins. May be useful for microcystins. This is where the saxitoxin genes sort of came to its own. And they found the QPCR data to help direct their reservoir management strategies, and they saw a very good reason to include it in their rule book, and they've continued to do so. So I'll actually just show you one other slide. This is their seasonal monitoring requirements. You can download these, but what they've used the 12 months worth of data is to characterise their reservoirs into 3 risk categories. Ones that have actually always shown sort of levels of toxic species, to level Schedule 3 where there is very few or little toxic species, and they go on to a monthly QPCR only test. And once they detect a gene test, they will go into weekly testing for toxins as well as QPCR. And there's the second level of risk is bi-weekly. 1 week there'll be QPCR, and the second week they'll do raw water microcystin ELISA tests. And if you're in a high-risk category, you do bi-weekly QPCR, and if you find a gene, you have to go to weekly testing. So they've sort of monitored or staged their risk levels based on sort of the historical data they now have for their reservoirs, and they continue to sort of be particularly happy with how it's working. And I have to acknowledge in this, the Ohio EPA allowed me to sort of present their data, but obviously their enthusiasm to the technology, and at that I'll stop.